Okay. Hi, Ibrahim. So everybody's on now. People are slowly coming in so everyone can hear us, I think, hopefully. If not, send a message in the chat. Thank you so much to everyone for joining. Thank you to Ibrahim Dalalsha, who is our guest this morning on this webinar. I just wanted to flag that we have a number of events planned, including two next week. For everyone, please register. We'll have online also Amir Tibon from Haaretz, who also recently wrote a book, The Gates of Gaza, which just won the Book of the Year from the National Jewish Book Awards. Will be speaking to us. And then later that day on February 6th, also, I will be meeting and we will be hosting together with the Israel Policy Forum, Michael Koplow, to discuss the regional dynamic in particular and looking closely at Israel-Turkey relations. So that should be interesting. So please do register when you get a chance. But today our guest is Ibrahim Dalalsha, as I mentioned. Ibrahim is a friend and has been a real fixture on the Palestinian political scene for a number of decades. He's been helping all of us understand and analyze the internal politics and as they relate to the situation in the region. So he, of course, was an advisor to the US Consulate in Jerusalem back when the US had a consulate in Jerusalem all those years ago for over 20 years. And he is currently the director, the head of the Horizon Center, which is a Ramallah-based independent strategic studies and media outreach organization. In addition to its sort of mission statement to promote peace, security, stability, economic prosperity, and human rights and minority civic rights for the Palestinian people, the Horizon Center is also keen to promote peaceful resolution of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict and promote transparent and efficient Palestinian governance by bridging gaps in understanding and promoting opportunities for direct dialogue between Palestinian and international policymakers, academics, which is us today, and civil society activists. So, Ibrahim, thank you so much for being with us here today and sharing your expertise. I'll ask you to give your thoughts on the situation, and then we can open it up to questions from the online audience. So for the audience, please send your questions in the appropriate chat, and then I'll moderate those questions in the second half of this hour. Ibrahim, before I turn it over to you, I mean, really, it sounds ridiculous to ask you such huge questions in some ways, but there's so much happening right now. Of course, maybe foremost in our minds is, of course, the ceasefire and hostage release and the scenes that we're seeing from Gaza and in the West Bank and in Israel. It's of course still in its early stages. We understand how fragile it all is, but I think that maybe one area that we have less visibility on over here is really the impact of this agreement on Palestinian politics in some ways. In addition, obviously the dynamics in the West Bank have extreme tension, extreme levels of violence. I think trying to understand, if and how really October 7th and the war has impacted the situation on the ground, and then maybe, a few words about what political changes might be in store, what the political scene looks like, internal dialogue between the factions, Fatah and Hamas, a possibility of elections, all of these things that are always on our mind when we think about Palestinian politics. But I really can think of no one better at this particular moment to help us understand that. So Ibrahim, the floor is yours, please. And after 25-30 minutes, we'll open it up for questions. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jonathan, for having me. Indeed, very difficult questions, and the analysis is one thing, and basically trying to project what exactly is going to happen is another thing, because it is such a fluid dynamics and moving sort of like variables in certain conflicting ways. But if I were actually to go back to where you actually mentioned, rightly so, the fact that this is a fragile stage, and I don't mean, for those who have not really been following much of those details, but basically we're talking about first phase of a ceasefire that would last for 42 days, and I think that is very is stable in the sense that regardless of certain violations that could come from either side, I think both sides are committed and will actually continue the first phase. The problem starts upon the end of it. As of January 19th, we're talking about 42 days, and that is when negotiations on the second phase should actually be concluded, and we move into the second phase. The second phase clearly is going to be a much more difficult agreement because it entails big decisions like end of war and basically more difficult decisions that have to be taken politically by the Israeli government to release even more Palestinian prisoners, the ones who have been sentenced for life, and there are like very difficult names for the Israeli political government in its current form with the coalition that it has to actually endorse. Regardless of the complication of whether or not there will be a second phase agreement in time, many think that, and I tend to agree that I think what we could actually see is basically a floundering type of negotiations to reach an agreement, and it would be if both sides commit to the wording of the leaked document on this agreement, that ceasefire will be sustained throughout negotiations. So long as negotiations continue, there will be a sustained ceasefire. So I think, it's unrealistic almost to believe that this will actually end exactly on time, and the second phase and an end of war will be declared 42 days as of January 19th. On the other hand, it's also, I think there are certain positive dynamics that have developed over the last period of time, including the Trump administration, which was very heavy. And we here, actually, I think Palestinians collectively believe that if it wasn't for President Trump, this agreement could not have happened, essentially because of the weight that the pressure that was actually applied on all sides, but mainly also on the Israeli side. And therefore, I think a floundering, second stage negotiations is to be expected, hopefully with minimal breaches of the ceasefire, and the the ceasefire would actually be as such sustained. In terms of the implications of all of this on Israeli-Palestinian relations to begin with, on the West Bank, I mean, it's very obvious in Gaza, you have a situation where people have started returning to their places. Hamas has proven and demonstrated that it actually continues to exist as the only authority in Gaza. Which in my opinion is partly true because on one hand, yes, they are present there with guns, but the requirements for reconstruction and recovery of the Gaza Strip is not something that Hamas can do with guns. And therefore, their true actual moment of truth will start when there is a ceasefire in place and they have to answer, 30 to 50, depending on which side you cite in terms of how much expenses are needed for Gaza is not really something that Hamas can actually deliver. And therefore, the question of them having survived the war is one thing, and the question of being able to continue as a government that responds to the needs of Gaza is another thing. But leaving that aside for a second, the impact of this on the West Bank has not really been positive or as positive. There were Israeli military operations that were carried out almost in conjunction with the ceasefire in Gaza. And frankly, I think that the profiling of those military operations, especially in the northern West Bank, seem to be more than what is actually happening on the ground. In other words, there are no hundreds of gunmen who are like basically clashing with Israeli soldiers. There is a siege. There's an internal siege. There are specific pinpointed Israeli military operations in certain parts of refugee camps in the north, blowing up houses, searching house to house, and I'm not saying that this is actually not a military operation, but I think the way it was portrayed to public in both Israel and in Palestine, that this is, like a front almost equal to what happened in Gaza, I think is unfounded. In the West Bank, we have a situation where we do have security problems. We have certain armed formations in different parts of the West Bank. But like what is missing from that narrative is the fact that the Palestinian Authority continues to coordinate in all security matters with Israel. It's not the most efficient system, but it's not engaging in hostile activities against the Israeli army, which is a situation that could really take us to a situation similar to Gaza, if you have thousands of gunmen out there clashing with Israeli forces. So, the immediate impact has been rising, the level of tensions in the West Bank, I would actually say, to be as accurate, reflecting what is actually happening. And in many ways, in terms of the public posturing, I think the PA has been undermined in a very serious way. And I'll explain, and this has to do with the perception of Palestinian public to what's happening, and I'm specifically referring to the West Bank here, to what has been happening in Gaza. The immediate reflection of internal closure on the West Bank and Israeli military operations in the northern West Bank and elsewhere, also in Nablus area, have actually created an impression, enhanced an already existing impression that the Palestinian Authority is not in a position to defend its people. It cannot really impact and guarantee their movement and access. It is irrelevant to the Palestinian people's basic needs. Second, in the context of the ceasefire agreement, there has been releases of Palestinian prisoners who have been serving long-term sentences, including people from before the Oslo Agreement, who the Palestinian Authority had abandoned as perceived in public eye, and has not been able to release them over the years. Whereas Hamas, with its strategy and negotiations with Israel, is in a position to release them. So that added further, weakening of the Palestinian public posture. And then, you talk about other problems that the Palestinian public in the West Bank, including Palestinian Authority constituency, if you will, which is the public sector, are mocking, some of them on social media, postings, are mocking the Palestinian Authority for not being able to resolve the tax revenues problem, where Israel withholds Palestinian tax revenues problems, or a big portion of it, and the PA is unable to pay them their full salaries for about a few years now. So all of these things come together, which reflect, certain weaknesses of the Palestinian Authority's performance in terms vis-a-vis Israel. And then, also internally, you have an autocracy that is not tolerating. So they close Al Jazeera TV. They prevent people from actually showing on Al Jazeera TV. They carried out certain moves, which I think, in the PA's perspective, in defense of its own narrative against Hamas's narrative, but I think that this have actually undermined the Palestinian Authority's public stature in many big ways. Now, we're not going to elections immediately, and therefore, I think that the Palestinian Authority can tolerate this. But the truth is, I think we are a moment of euphoria, a moment of eruption of emotions, where you have West Bankers mostly celebrating, happy with what happened in terms of the ceasefire, in terms of return of Gazans displaced to their houses, release of prisoners, definitely. But I think these are passing moments, because at the end, even people in Gaza who have returned to their homes, which no longer exist, will wake up to a reality that we need like solutions beyond release of prisoners and beyond a ceasefire agreement that is still fragile. How that reflected on the internal Palestinian politics, Hamas and Fatah. We continue to be a bipolar system. We have no political space. We have no political party law. We have no space for the emergence of new political entities. So we continue to be a bipolar system by far. You have a patronage force in Gaza, which is Hamas. You have a patronage force in the West Bank, which is Fatah and the Palestinian Authority. And all the 15 months of war in Gaza did not bring those two parties closer. In fact, it brought them even farther in terms of all aspects, including political positions vis-a-vis conflict with Israel, internal governance issues, power sharing. Um, there has been no even serious attempt. I mean, there were attempts, but not serious ones, to actually create a common ground for all factions. And this is why, we've seen the Beijing declaration as one attempt, but it had no chance of being translated. Before that, we had the Algeria and many other declarations trying to get a common ground between Fatah on one hand and Hamas on the other. And all of those have fallen. In my opinion, I think one of the key reasons why the war and the consequences of the war have not really created, including the ceasefire agreement, have not really created a good solid ground or foundation for bringing the two factions together, is the conflicting strategies, but also, and more importantly, conflicting interests. I think President Abbas, with the Palestinian Authority and Fatah movement, have taken a step back. And that step back relates to their disapproval of the Hamas October 7 attacks, and the status of Hamas as a terrorist organization around the world would actually, I think, in many ways have played into they're thinking that we cannot have and extend the hand and bring in Hamas to the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which is the umbrella, sort of like organization for all factions, because this will add burden and it will even hurt more the PLO. Hamas, on its side, I think, wanted to continue be a central player in the picture, and that's why even proposals to actually get the PLO to negotiate the ceasefire rather than Hamas were dismissed by Hamas's leadership, because they wanted to be central in the picture. And maybe, quote unquote, they were proven correct in that, as negotiations with them have yielded results that Hamas, is basically trying to write a narrative of having achieved certain gains and broken and broke the Israeli political positions that were put out there from the beginning, and the end result is we still have we do have basically channels of contact, if you will, between the two sides, and some of them are indirect through Egyptians and through Qataris and other players, but none of them have actually been able to bridge any gap. The last attempt was to try and minimize, those sort of like factions talks to a day after plan for Gaza, a governance system in Gaza. And Hamas, I think, because of the level of challenges that they have in front of them in Gaza, have declared more than once that we have no problem in the PA coming back to Gaza. We have no problem in having a community technocrat to govern Gaza, or any other such proposals, and we will no longer hold to governance in Gaza. Having said that, what they do want, and it's not stated upfront, is a role in the PLO and in Palestinian political landscape that they're not actually willing to give up. And that is where the Fatah leadership, President Abbas and others, are basically adamant not to play that game. I think, and I have to actually mention one thing here, because this is not a new dynamic. We have this division, we've had it for about 20 years now, 17, 18 years. And in my opinion, and I've been through the experience of these talks between the two factions, and have seen also how it reflects on the international and the regional stage. I think if we do not have principles that are shared and agreed by all the stakeholders, including the US, including Israel, including Egypt, Qatar, and other players, there are no prospects for a Fatah-Hamas agreement to actually emerge and be implemented. I mean, there could be, we had many agreements reached in the past, but they all, failed because I think the context of those agreements was completely, disconnected from the wider stakeholder circles, including the international community, the US and Israel. There were attempts to try and reach solutions for governance in Gaza. One specific problem, which I think ought to be and will come up whenever they talk about governance in Gaza, is what to do with the 40,000 bureaucrats who have been working under Hamas. Some of them are Hamas members, many others are not, but basically working for Hamas's governance in Gaza for the past 17 years. What do you do with them? Hamas would always push to keep them. The PA would always push to take them out and bring in its own bureaucracy. And even middle ways that were reached in 2014 were disapproved mostly by Israel, and therefore the PA was unable to continue with an initial agreement that they had reached with Israel there. So we go back to the same attempt trying to reach a Fatah-Hamas agreement, but in my opinion, without taking like the wider regional and international positions and principles for what works and what doesn't, it's not going to be a successful attempt. In terms of the immediate, I think, concern, which is whether or not we move beyond the threshold of the second phase. Because again, it's extremely difficult to basically analyze the situation and project what could happen and what's the level of those implications in certain, like security, political, and others, without determining whether this is a lasting ceasefire, this is the end of the war, or we're actually, in a pause that could, and we could actually see a return to military hostilities in Gaza. Now, if we were to actually talk about them in two different scenarios, I think, an end to the to the war and a ceasefire, a lasting ceasefire, would necessitate. There is no alternative to it. I mean, the slogans, with all due respect, are not going to serve anyone in this situation. You cannot have a stable governance in Gaza if you do not have a minimal level of understanding between all players. And that level of understanding, if I were to introduce principles that could work regionally and internationally, I would say that they remove Hamas completely from governance, and that is possible. It's not an impossible mission. I think that the war has broken Hamas's foundations for governance in Gaza. Before, Hamas was being supplied with enough resources, was actually importing goods and commodities through Rafah Salahuddin crossing, was getting funds also from other sources, and was able, with difficulty, but was able to govern. With the level of challenges that they have now, between $30 to $50 billion, depending who assessed so far, and I think an accurate assessment will come later. Hamas has no means and no resources and cannot be in a position to do that. So therefore, they will transfer that responsibility to anybody that could actually they reach agreement on with Fatah. The reluctance of Fatah is not going to be resolved by itself, and I think if we do not have a specific plan that brings in principles that could be agreed upon, again, as I said earlier, we will not see a stable governance. Imposition of a PA authority of itself against the will of the remnants of Hamas and remnants of Islamic Jihad and other factions in Gaza will lead to an internal strife, and that means instability, and that means no conducive environment for recovery and longer-term reconstruction. It is no secret to say that with the Trump administration, everyone has their eyes on what Trump administration would do. In fact, most recently, as we speak, I'm hearing that contacts are initiated between the U.S. envoy and Palestinian Authority and PLO officials. On the other hand, we have seen some senior Hamas people actually calling publicly on the administration to engage in a dialogue. So instead of actually Hamas and Fatah, and you see this dynamic, sort of like playing itself out, instead of actually getting together and have one unified agenda and engage in a dialogue with it publicly or privately with the US or others, each side is trying to basically break that and break their own ways into some sort of a dialogue and some sort of a settlement, maybe. Now, under the scenario where we go back to war, frankly, I don't see, other than Gaza being turned into a wasteland, maybe more of international organizations access relief and the like into Gaza with with decentralized authority. By the way, when the war stopped, before the war stopped, Gaza was turned into bubbles of warlords, certain areas Hamas civilian dressed, other areas Islamic Jihad, but lawlessness was a main feature of the situation in Gaza. And with the war stopping and the emergence of Hamas, police and gunmen deployed throughout the Gaza Strip. You hear from people, not only warlords and thieves and others have actually disappeared, but even um, merchants and prices of commodities that were like rocket high had actually sky high had actually subsided. So if we go back to that kind of scenario, like where the war reemerges, I think we will see everything from what we had seen throughout the past 15 months and even worse. That's not, of course, I mean, on the Israeli side, there are also, I know that there are political complications, unstable coalition, threats of resignation that could push things one way or the other. But regardless, I think everyone collectively here thinks that it depends almost entirely on whether or not the Trump administration will put enough pressure again for this to be sustained and turned into an end of war. And I think all players here are so focused on what the Trump administration could do. Now, there is one thing that came out lately, which I would actually say bluntly, like that's not a solution and it doesn't work. Removing and relocating Gaza population and its 2 million to other places. I mean, all these things, first of all, in terms of how it's immediately perceived here, whether at the level of the Palestinian Authority or Hamas, by the way, and, or anybody else for that matter, pushing Palestinians out. I mean, you could succeed, frankly, individuals. Like if you offer $1 million for an individual to move to Amman, maybe, if you can sustain that. But in a collective sense, moving the population out of Gaza, even physically, it's impossible, because remember that there are certain factions that continue to control Gaza, and people have no access. There's no airport, and there is no place that they can do. So even physically, it's unimplementable. When it comes to the political aspects of it, there are two angles to it. There is the angle on the Palestinian side who actually refuse to actually move out of their territories, because it happened in 48, it happened in 67, and people who actually left were never allowed to come back. So there is no trust and confidence that this is going to be a temporary measure. And people don't want to live refugees a second or a third or a fourth time in their lifetime. So it's against the culture and, against the mindset of Palestinians. And, there are additional factors that I think people, with all the difficulties that they have in Gaza, all the difficulties that they go through in the West Bank, I think being refugees in any other neighboring country has not really proven to be a better way of life. And if you want an evidence of that, the way that the Palestinians perceive it, you can take Lebanon, where people are basically deprived of 85 professions throughout the past 7 or 8 decades. So people don't want to repeat that kind of experience. And the other angle to it, which I think is very troubling, is the fact that for those who zoom in on the Palestinian-Jordanian relations, understand the sensitivity of those relations. Since the creation of the Kingdom of Jordan, since 48, passing through 1970, 69 and 70 clashes between the two sides in Jordan, and the delicate, composition of the population in Jordan, with Palestinian origins being about 70% of it, and adding even 1 million Gazan to that mix is not going to help stabilize the country that has been providing. The only thing that Jordan has been truly providing, genuinely providing, is stability and security, and being a safety valve. All the crises that we had throughout the past 20, 30 years in the Middle East, Jordan was the only place where it remained, a stability site for Iraqis, for Syrians, for Palestinians. So I think, people are not taking that, they're taking it seriously because it comes from the US president. But when it comes to whether or not it will be implementable, people are thinking, oh, this is just siding, or maybe having heard Israeli radicals, Israeli right-wing, trying to influence thinking of the administration. But the administration will get to a point where they understand that this is not a solution. I mentioned this because it added to the mix recently. I have some other things that I could actually say, but I'd rather leave them, like in terms of how could the situation be, approached? Because one key element to this is that the war, these October 7 attacks, as heinous as they were, and the subsequent war, as terrible as it was, we are in a conflict that, if it doesn't find a political solution, I have no doubts in my mind that this will be repeated in different forms, in different ways, in different areas, maybe the West Bank, it's not bound to end by military force. And the proof is, even if you look backwards, you will see that this is becoming a very clearly almost generational sort of divide. People who get older basically give up and they're not, willing to fight anymore. But people who are younger, they come into this situation and they rise against it in difficult ways, in horrific ways, yes, but basically they rise against it. So in the past, without even going to 48, and 67, but in every 20 years, since the creation of Israel, since Nakba, in every 20 years, we have a major eruption of violence, 48, 67, 87, First Intifada, 2002, Second Intifada. And then we got this. And if you don't have a political solution to it, then, there are no guarantees that this is not going to erupt again. In 10 years, in 20 years, in 30 years, no one really, has a crystal ball to actually say when. But all the dynamics of a conflict continue to fuel it on both sides, Israeli side and the Palestinian side, and the next generation will find itself to be exactly in the same spot. It's an intersection. Now we have an opportunity, frankly, to move beyond the ceasefire and actually move on political terms, where you would bring in, obviously, right now, I think it's a plan, but it's not like maybe the most immediate pressing thing is ceasefire, and not that plan, which is bringing in normalization agreement with Saudi Arabia and create a parallel path. I mean, it doesn't have to be consequential necessarily, but a parallel path towards a Palestinian statehood, two-state solution that actually turns the Palestinian state, instead of a security threat, but a part of political and a security structure in the region. So, it's not only up to the Palestinian state. The Palestinian state will be demilitarized in most probable ways, but it will become a part of a regional network and a regional structure that provides security and stability, not only to Israel, to Jordan, to Egypt, to Saudi Arabia. And of course, the benefits of that solution, if they do happen, go beyond, starting with security, but they go beyond security to development, economic activities, de-radicalization of the entire region, because you take away one of the key pretexts that are used by extremists, especially on the Arab and the Muslim side, that has to do with the, so long as the occupation continues, the conflict will continue, and so on. But the creation of a Palestinian state also puts an end, and let me be frank here, to some Israeli right-wing, like members or parties who have no problem in actually portraying maps of Israel going through even Jordan. So you're not only, with the expansionist sort of policies of certain parties in Israel, they're not only scaring Palestinians, they're also alienating their own, should-be peace allies who have signed treaties with them. In other words, a two-state solution is going to be, in my opinion, an end of conflict in so many different aspects, including the fact that Israel will be living in full integration and normalization with people around the region accepting it, not only autocrats of certain countries. So that, I think, is a more is a deeper, and maybe now it's very much sounds like a dream. But I think, frankly, in all realistic ways, if that dream does not start showing signs of life, then I'm very pessimistic that this is going to be a permanent end of war. Jonathan, I'm not sure I actually took all the 20 minutes or not. I
This
could
is
talk for another
wonderful.
hour, but I
No,
think,
thank you.
yeah,
I was
yeah.
hesitant to stop you because I thought that this was a really, fantastic, your sort of broad, also historical overview. I think to sum it up in some ways, we say, your talk is really focused on those who don't learn from history are condemned to repeat it, of course. So I think you illustrated that very well, and it's a lot of food for thought. There are already a number of questions in the chat, but I want to take the opportunity to ask a couple of my own that have come up, and actually one relates to one of the questions in the chat from your old boss or former Consul General, Ambassador Wallace, who's on the line. So great to have you. I think you answered the question in some ways. It relates to the ongoing discussions between Fatah and Hamas regarding reconciliation and governance in Gaza. But if I could maybe frame it in a different way, it seems like there's this sort of reconstruction imperative, right? Something's going to have to happen with regard to reconstruction on the ground, just given the scale of the destruction in Gaza. But yet, the pre-existing tension, you mentioned, 18 years of internal division, really civil war, in some ways, at some periods. How does this move forward? I mean, there's been discussion about a potential of a Hezbollah model. This idea that Hamas maintains its sort of security control on the ground and therefore has some sort of a veto, over the situation on the ground, and by maintaining its weapons. I mean, as unpalatable as a situation like that is, what are the prospects of actually disarming Hamas? You mentioned the idea of Hamas not being involved in governance, and I tend to agree that might be a little bit easier, but I think it's more about how they exercise control, from behind the scenes. How do you see that playing out, in a realistic way? And then you also mentioned, maybe related, you also mentioned the role of Egypt and Qatar, but also we've seen others engaged. Traditionally, Russia has played a role in trying to bring the factions together. Also, China more recently. Is any of this realistic? Is any of this serious? Over to you, Ibrahim.
Yeah, no, thank you. Yes, it's a very complex situation indeed, and again, I want to stress the point that first of all, I think when it comes, we in the Palestinian Authority, for people who are not really very who don't really know the nuances and the details of our system, we have a dual structure. And that dual structure is actually a tradition that we have inherited from decades ago. So we have the PLO, which practically is an umbrella organization that is defunct in terms of provision of services, because it has never done that. Maybe they have done that in diaspora countries like in Lebanon, Syria before, but in practice, the PA was created after Oslo Agreement, and it is the government that actually delivers the services, controls finances, and controls security forces on the ground. And removing Hamas from governance in Gaza, which Hamas took over, by the way, in 2007, as everybody knows, but essentially taking them out from these, I think, should be the focus. And again, I want to highlight and stress that without, and when you say the region, yes, you mentioned Russia, China, and others, but I think the parties and the regional players that have a more direct, effective, influential role are Qatar, Egypt, Turkey to some extent in terms of influencing Hamas's decisions, and the farther you go from the region, the less. But then definitely the US and definitely Israel, and the Palestinian Authority stands, I think, within parameters that would not cross anything that hurts its credibility and relations, whether with Israel or with the United States. This is the way that it has actually, all those agreements that were signed between, and declarations that were signed between Hamas and Fatah were done for rhetoric and were never implemented on the ground. And in certain cases, frankly, the PA was unable, even if they wanted to, like when they wanted to take over the Gaza bureaucracy in 2014, and they were prevented from passing a penny to Gaza, and therefore, they couldn't really live up to it, and the agreement collapsed. I'm not saying that the internal Fatah-Hamas divide is essentially, a problem that is caused by Israel. But I'm saying that without a clear policy that could actually have a minimal level of principles that could work, the chances of that will not be high. And reconstruction, you mentioned, I think, frankly, in addition to this problem, which is you need to have like stability, you need to have a ceasefire, lasting ceasefire, and you need to have proper governance, and you need to have law enforcement and security. You also need, I think, guarantees that the situation is not going to fall back into another confrontation if Hamas continues to exist as a military wing in Gaza. So many of the donor countries will not be investing billions in a project that they know will actually collapse or likely to collapse in a year or 2 or 3 or 4. Like it's not a wise investment. So we go back to the main question. If we do not, again, this is not only a Fatah Hamas problem. If we do not really get into a situation where there is clear principles that are accepted by both, pushed through, and when we say regional partners, they're not all on the same page, by the way. There are certain countries, in my opinion, frankly, Egypt is influenced more by Emirates than by Qatar. Qatar pushes Hamas further much more than Emirat does, and Emirati relations with the Palestinian Authority are toxicated. So it gets complicated if you leave it to those players to actually come up with an agreement, and that's why I'm saying there needs to be a clear strategy and a clear principles on which a governance structure needs to be created in the region. What is missing right now? There was based on my private talk with the Palestinian Authority officials, there was a US non-paper that was presented on a transitional mission in Gaza. And that transitional mission would actually exclude Hamas, of course, and will exclude to a large extent the Palestinian Authority itself, except for certain services. And the PA thought, well, since this was presented by the Biden administration, they're waiting to hear from the Trump administration. And so far, there hasn't really been a plan or a strategy or even principles presented by the Trump administration. So we're still in a limbo. And I think, the immediate concern is the ceasefire. The second immediate thing is governance stable in Gaza. It's not impossible. I think it's doable, frankly. You mentioned Hezbollah, like Hezbollah, moving Hezbollah from governance does not mean that they eliminated, that they were eliminated from the face of earth. And I think, that is where you need to define what kind of Hamas we could actually agree with. Maybe a political proposal for Hamas to transform itself could actually be part of a package that could be, given for them to reconsider whether they want to be part of a political structure under the PLO and not under the PA. Again, I make the distinction because it's real here. We have a clear, defined distinction between the Palestinian Authority and the PLO, and that is a window where I think even regional and international stakeholders could actually use for good reasons to actually say, well, we don't care about factions sitting together in Cairo and talking about politics. We care about who controls the ground in Gaza. And from there we start. So Hamas is not part of it, but we accept technocrats' independence. And moving on. That is the type, I think, of an arrangement that the question of disarmament, completely demobilization, I think it's impossible to achieve at the beginning. But if you initiate a process where you have governance, where you have stability, where you have a lasting ceasefire, and on that line, you break it along the lines of, trying to reach a political solution to the conflict in line with the demilitarization of the Palestinian state, then I think pressure will mount, including on factions like Hamas and others, to actually do that within a Palestinian context, not necessarily an Israeli context. It becomes part of a larger, peace process in the region, rather than it's an Israeli command. Because if it's an Israeli command, we'll fight it. That's the logic that so far controls and governs those dynamics. So it's not impossible, but it's not really an immediate thing that they could cooperate with. Yeah.
Yeah, no, interesting, and interesting to see that there's at least some room for optimism there, and of course the role of the region is vital. I'm going to ask a couple, go back to the chat here. I'll try and prioritize some students here, but I see that one of the participants asked, and I'll just read it directly. How do you think that the crisis of credibility that international organizations and NGOs face following their direct and indirect involvement with Hamas's activities, both before and during the war, would now hinder their ability to aid reconstruction efforts in Gaza? So basically the acrimony between Israel and the UN and
yeah. No, I think that relates the most, I think, to UNRWA. In other cases, I think in 2014 there was one specific case with a UNDP contractor, and so on. I think, frankly, the Israeli system has been against and attacked UNRWA even before. I think they knew that there were problems with the UNRWA system. I think what people don't know is that there are more than 25,000 Palestinian workers for UNRWA. They have, like an international mandate and a flag and upper management. But essentially, you would expect that there will be problems within of that sort. Political affiliations, because it is an overwhelmingly Palestinian-managed organization. I don't think that the UNRWA administration have in any way or means tolerated any of those things. I worked for UNRWA, by the way, for 10 years in my past, as I started, and I know exactly that the fact that there are overwhelming Palestinian employees, it's essentially a Palestinian organization that has a UN flag. I think, frankly, on the specifics of problems, whether there were 12 staff or others who attacked Israelis on October 7 or were part of it, or even talking about wider and deeper Hamas affiliated people and staff in UNRWA. I think the problem with UNRWA is much bigger and much broader. To the point is, UNRWA has been, throughout the past seven plus decades, a major stability factor in the region. UNRWA has been actually keeping, I think, even more radicalization of Palestinian refugees, because imagine if you had a situation where no one takes care of them. Imagine if there are millions of Palestinian students basically in the streets, vulnerable only to radical organizations and militants. UNRWA has really served on the plus side many things. Now, when you talk about the right of return and the political solution to refugees, that's one thing. And when you talk about the operations of UNRWA and how it actually contributed to stability is another thing, in my opinion. I understand that people have very strong opinions about UNRWA perpetuating the conflict, the refugee problem, and all of that. I tend to think, on the other side, that a political solution to the conflict, including two-state solution, is what provides the Palestinians with a homeland and what provides the Israelis with a safe homeland. If you come to think about, and then UNRWA is an organization that will have to be, in my opinion, that will have to die naturally. The reasons that actually brought UNRWA to life will be the same factors like in real human being life will take it away. But killing it, I think, abruptly is going to create waves of and threats of security nature, because you cannot abandon millions of people, not only the ones in Gaza. We're talking about Gaza, we're talking about the West Bank, and I think, those who want to kill UNRWA, they think about killing it in Jordan and in Lebanon and in Syria, not only, here. So I really understand the vulnerabilities and the problems and the weaknesses, and we need to fix certain things that UNRWA has been doing through a reform program, through a vetting program, many other things in order to actually get where we need to, versus, they had 12 staff attacking us, so we need to kill it, all of it. I mean, I think that is more emotionally, maybe, sort of like an ideology behind the whole conflict, rather than trying to address a problem with international organizations. Others, I think that they had I mean, I'm not aware, other than this UNDP contractor in the past, who had supplied or worked with some Hamas people in Gaza. I'm not aware that there is such a big problem with international organizations in Gaza, and proven so, many of them continue to work. And I maybe should not, or I should. I'm not on the media. Even UNRWA is still working in Gaza, and I think that they will have to continue working in Gaza so long as there is no alternative. And creating an alternative is not really a practical matter. So that I think puts it into more of a political conflict rather than a real sort of like security problem, being an international organization as such.
No, thank you so much. I'm glad that's actually the subject of my class today. We're talking about UNRWA, so thank you for setting that up. I think that maybe just to add to that, and from my own experience, I think it's interesting that the discussion is actually focused on killing UNRWA, as you said. Rightly or wrongly, perhaps, but the alternative that even Israel is suggesting is other UN agencies. So I think we see the role of the international community in some respect. The question is the politics behind it and which agency and everything like that. It's definitely
exactly
application, but I don't think we can expect the international community to disappear. I'll ask. I think we have time for maybe one or two more, but I see a question from a student here, so I'll just read again. A sort of more historical background here. Since the British Mandate, Palestinian leadership has not agreed to a single land partition that involves the existence of a sovereign Jewish state. When you say this will repeat unless we find a diplomatic solution, what kind of diplomatic solution do you see the Palestinians agreeing to in which a Jewish state continues to exist?
My time?
Yes, please, Ibrahim, please.
Thank you. That's a very important question. And I will only, just if you allow me, just go briefly back to 1947 rather than 1948. Look, I think, frankly, the way to look at this situation is as follows. First of all, if we continue blaming each other, Israelis and Palestinians, who did right and who did wrong, like my grandfather in 48 disagreed to the partition of Palestine, it's going to be an endless conflict. So we'll continue fighting until, like generation after generation like this until, end of days. And there are ideologies, I'm sorry, like on both sides, who actually fuel that, who want this conflict to continue until end of days. And in fact, they believe in it. They believe it that way. So, if we take it back to mainstream politics, the partition of Palestine plan in 47, which was rejected by the Palestinians at that time, for reasons that are, whether it's about emotional, whether it's about like hate, whether it's about why should we give up our land? I mean, I'm not even going to think why it happened. It happened. 40 years later, the Palestinians have actually declared independence in Algeria in 1988. And in that declaration, the only reference of an international birth certificate for the state of Palestine was referred to the 181 partition Palestine plan. The Palestinians have politically and legally speaking already confirmed, not only in terms of a rhetoric, but in terms of a legal commitment that they made through the PLO National Council at the time, that we are committed to the birth of a Palestinian state through the partition of Palestine, which of course gives Israel as a Jew and describes Israel as a Jewish state, by the way, on the historic land of Palestine. And further, when Oslo Agreement was signed, the Palestinians went down from the partition of Palestine plan, which actually gives them more geographic area of historic Palestine, into 1967 lines. So, and this is, I'm not saying this because, I want to prove that the Palestinians have been genuine. I understand and realize that there were so many problems and faults on our side. What I'm calling for is actually a more reasonable thinking on the Israeli side as well, of actually saying, okay, fine, like we are here today, and continuing to discuss the past and past mistakes is not really going to help us, other than continuing with the conflict if this is what people want. But what we can do is that, is take these principles that we already have. And in fact, in recent, in sort of like more advanced discussions between the two sides, the idea of land swaps was proposed, in which the Palestinians would even not commit it's not a situation, when we talk about two-state solution, this is not about saying Israel needs to go back to 1967 lines exactly as they were on June 4th. We are talking about a process. And by the way, I'm one of those who actually say the following. First of all, managing the conflict peacefully is one thing. Reaching a solution to it is another thing. I'm a strong proponent of actually engaging in a peace process that delivers, slowly and gradually, but systematically towards resolving the conflict, and let it last for another 10 years or 20 years even, depending on how generous you are in terms of promoting the process, not starting a process and continuing to take over more land and doing more, provocative things. Neither side, should be doing provocative things to the other side during a process like this. It will take us more time. We need more time. By the way, in the immediate wake of the war, we need time to heal. Like the Palestinians need time to heal. The Israelis definitely need time to heal. The idea of territorial concessions in Israel is basically dead on arrival. No one is going to entertain that seriously. So, we need a process, and a process that delivers, not a process that actually discredits itself by adding more settlements. And, like if we're talking about mistakes, the Israelis on their side too, after signing Oslo agreement, they actually multiplied, in terms of land, in terms of settlements, creating and expanding settlements in the West Bank, which discredited the whole process from day one. So, again, I think it's not about going back and blaming. It's about looking ahead and saying, are we destined to continue like basically rounds of violence, or we should have a stop and go in a different direction and manage the conflict in more peaceful ways?
Well, thank you, Ibrahim. Maybe one more, if we have time, because I realize that the hour is getting late. How does the PA work on a two-state solution with Israel when Netanyahu has been very clear in his stance that there will never be a Palestinian state?
I think the answer to that is very frank. The Palestinians don't really believe Netanyahu, because he once stood up and said that he believes in a Palestinian state. That was like in 2009 when Obama took over office in the US. And then it turned out that he does not actually believe in it. And now he says that he does not believe in it. And I think, whatever he says is not really what determines. I think what the Palestinians are trying to do right now is to project the Palestinian state as a positive contributor to stability, to Israel, to the region. And I think they're building a lot on connection to Saudi Arabia. In fact, let me break a secret. I think senior Palestinian officials today are in Riyadh with the Minister of Foreign Affairs, and they are preparing to meet with the US envoy, Witkoff. So the Palestinians come to this process now, this time armed with the Saudi Arabia angle or context, and trying to build around it to present and provide the U.S. administration and the Israeli government, which, by the way, just have to tell you that the Palestinians do know for a fact that so long as this government in Israel continues to be in place, there are no prospects for not only two-state solution, there is no prospects for cooperation on any level. So yes, the Palestinians don't think that this government is going to, to do it or break it, but I think they think more, beyond that, in terms of the region and in terms of the U.S. administration and in terms of Israeli public, who, according to public opinion polls of elections and when elections will be held in Israel, it's more likely that it's not going to be the same government. So, the Palestinian, I wouldn't even call it a strategy. I would actually say the Palestinian vision or plan for now is actually to work very closely with Saudi Arabia and trying to present itself and the Palestinian state as a partner to peace, security, and stability, and discuss those details and start a process that actually takes us there. One thing to mention, which I think people misunderstood, is, when Emirates and the Abraham Accords were signed, the Palestinian position against it was, I think, misarticulated and misread. Misarticulated by the Palestinian leadership and misread by the wider audiences, because it wasn't about, against normalization between Israel and Arabs. It's essentially about bypassing the Palestinian cause and conflict and doing, normalization deals that excludes the Palestinians and keep them under occupation, which is what was stated by the Israeli Prime Minister in more than one occasion. For now, I think that they're trying to link themselves. and with regard or with disregard to Netanyahu's positions that have been throughout the past decades actually fluctuating between, yes, we can accept a state, no, we won't accept a state. So they're not really buying or cashing on this specific Israeli prime minister's position, but trying to build more of a consensus around the concept of a Palestinian state being an end to the conflict.
Thank you so much, Ibrahim. And this brings us really to
Thank you,
the end.
Jonathan.
I just want to, first thank you so much for your time. I also want to apologize for those who posed questions in the chat that we just don't have time for. They were all very good questions. I also think that I would love to expand on the situation inside the West Bank, the relationship with between the PA and the factions and the clashes that have been going on. I think all of these aspects are issues that we don't fully understand sitting where we are in terms of their implications on the ground. But all that to say, Ibrahim, we need you again, perhaps, hopefully when you get to town, you can come and see us in person. We'd love to host you at Georgetown.
Thank you.
And hopefully we can do this again. Thank you very much. Extremely informative.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Thank you. Anytime, let me know. No problem. Thank you.
And
Thank
the
you very
audience.
much.
Thank you so much, Ibrahim.
Thank you.
All the
Bye-bye.
best to
Thank you.
everybody.
Bye-bye.
Take care.
Thanks. Bye-bye.